Hello everyone, today we talk about the Iberian Scutarius between, say, the 4th and the 2nd century BC. I think that within the span of 1 year I made 2 videos about the tactics and the organization, respectively, of the Iberians and the Celto-Iberians that are included in the picture here. But we never discussed like single unit types, single warrior types, and the Iberian Scutarius is, together with the Caetratus, the fundamental one. In fact, in Iberian, Celto-Iberian warfare, I will keep saying Iberian, but take it the general way, unless I specify strictly, narrowly Iberian, or I, in fact, talk openly about the Celto-Iberians, right? And if you have followed my content over the years, you know that, say, as fascinating as the differences between these peoples and units and armament and tactics can be, actually they were all pretty similar in many ways, right? Today we will mostly look at the armament of these guys, not much just the shield, that, as you know here, it's, the Scutarius is a Latin term that was used to describe these guys. There are, of course, also Hellenic sources we will draw from, plenty of, at least regarding in relation to the information you can expect to have from these times and places. And we will, in fact, highlight also the similarities between these peoples and, I don't know, think about the javelins that the Iberians use, very, very similar to the Roman ones, that, of course, was part of a broader homogeneity in Europe and the Mediterranean regarding the art of war, the type of tactics. We're essentially talking about sedentary tribal peoples that fought, as I always say, like with a shield, especially like talking heavy infantry, so that the one that actually matters, at least what matters the most comparatively, with oval in shape and with a couple of javelins, a sword, a helmet, better armor if they were affluent enough, and just, of course, different people. The Romans tended to uniform from their sensual standpoint, their military, etc. But there are varieties even within the legionnaires, and the overall, say, environment, politically and socially speaking, reflected at a military level is overall pretty similar, right? That's one of the fascinating things I always point out, that comparatively in pop culture you do not see so much hype for example, contemporary doctrinal armament, etc. differences between the contemporary militaries or even the modern ones. But when it gets to the ancient world, this sort of figurism, wargamism, for which every single detail must be, oh my god, this guy's fought in this different way, what's behind that, really, truthfully. And telling you the truth, there are great similarities. But that's also an advantage, like when you think that you can, in fact, from that sort of homogeneous basis to sort of, highlight what, in fact, differs, which is minimal. Sometimes it's sort of difficult even to explain why. You have always to bear in mind methodologically that you may be led astray by whatever level of evidence, documentary, archaeological, that can say, I don't know, that author said this about this people, so that becomes iconic for it. But if we hadn't had that author saying that, actually we wouldn't think that at all, and very often nobody else would say something similar. Of course, there is a broader picture that does make sense, right? As you know, I'm a great fan of documentary sources of historiography, meant as properly the historical sources. From my experience with military history, that narrative sources are shockingly reliable, right? To a degree that is being constantly undermined, not because of actual positive evidence that actually supported, in fact, the reliability of these sources, but this sense of deterministic, technologistic, materialistic, deterministic approach to history, for which these guys were writing, but they just had their heads in the clouds, right? And what they were writing is just, we know better, right? Or at least we must be skeptical because, never mind. This is the actual only thing that a thinking brain told us in an articulate, often also, poetic, but also concrete fashion that matches clamorously with also the archaeological evidence. But never mind, because this is just a guy saying something, and so we can't trust that by default, right? Distrust and paranoia are the first hallmark of the cultural inferiority of a people. Always remember that. And here we do a completely different thing. Naturally, the fun stands in sorting out the correct explanation, because many things are objectively unknown still, and this because of lack of documentation mostly. But through military logic, that is something you have to foster over time with a bit of practice and being very careful of the potential misuse of analogical thinking, you can get to some sound conclusions. And for other aspects, you just have to be humble enough in saying that at least at a given moment, there can't be theories that are better than others, but that we still objectively do not know about. And this is pretty obvious and notorious for even the Roman army. That is, of course, well documented compared to the others because it existed for a long time, if anything. But, in many ways we do not know. You can imagine for peoples like, say, the Iberians in a given section in time. Today we concentrate on this. So essentially the centuries immediately before the Roman conquest, but also Romanization, because as you know, these troops did, of course, participate to the Roman army broadly meant as auxiliary forces, and they contributed historically, even with some degree of course, of material influence on the same development of the Roman armament, the Roman military. Not talking just the obvious, like the Gladius Hispaniensis in this case, among the other things, but generally speaking, like the styles that Roman legionaries would maintain at provincial level, right, being, of course, influenced by the local tradition. In any case, again, the term Scutarius is the Latin name the Romans used for these guys equipped with the large oval shield. Scutum in Latin, of course, refers to the type of shield that the Greeks, but it's not quite the same thing, would have used as thureos, right? And that we shouldn't be too specific about, because aside from all the debate of what came from, let's say, where did the shield come from? Did someone invent it, eventually spread to other people? No, these shields are the simple, massive, concrete, logical way like a shield would develop. Like in these kind of cultures, again, are all pretty homogeneous, right? The Celts, the Italics had the scutum as such, and the Iberians had developed itself. Yes, there were influences, of course, in the Iberian Peninsula by the side of the Celts, but there were, this is a shield. How many types of shields can you think at this time, and how many do you see, especially at this time in history? This was, if you want, a pretty standard type of shield for European continental populations, and of course, a Latin author writing scutum was immediately clear to affect a Latin audience as far as what this type of shield was like. Of course, there were different ones. In fact, the Hydra is the other smaller one, and the main difference, as we were explaining before, was between, respectively, the heavy infantry equipped with these scuta, these large oval shields, and the one equipped with the Hydra that was instead like a buckler that was normally used by the skirmishers and lighter troops, right? This was true for the Italics, it was true for the Celts, it was true for pretty much anyone. The only difference that can characterize the Iberians in this context is the fact that their warfare, as we observed in the other videos on it, was characterized by some degree of greater agility. In other words, we're actually lighter. And this is not much of a compliment. It's just like what Scipio said fighting against them. These guys were great at ambushing, but in open field they were not that much. And this is a very important, datum to express, how difficult it was to conquer the Iberian hinterland for the Romans, but a bit like different conflicts that you see. It's always convincingly about the moral force, right? The Romans were not so interested in the Spanish hinterland. They just had to deal with it because guerrilla kept coming, incursions were affecting the more productive areas of the peninsula that, of course, the Romans had occupied for immediate interest in that case. And yet, you see an important degree of attrition carried out by mostly these guerrilla fighters, and guerrilla is a hard way of war, right? It just, however, admits that as long as you don't have forces capable of meeting the enemy in open ground on a regular basis, you carry that out from a condition of strategic inferiority that makes this type of warfare hard, in as much as you're more pressured to survive in a way, and so you will try to take out more surgically in detail with greater care, like the enemy that, however, maintains that advantage in a broader fashion. And of course, the campaigns against Numantia and the final conquest by Scipio Aemilianus would bring to the de facto subjection of, if not the entire Iberian Peninsula, but the further north was just a more peripheral area, in fact, even less relevant in that case. But still the experience of the Roman army in Spain, as you know, brought to some of the most important changes in the Capitoline military, including the development of the cohortal system, just to essentially reasons of that occupation forces would have to detach tactically autonomous units from the entire legions, right, to garrison more effectively the territory. This greater, again, flexibility necessary in the shockingly nightmarish Iberian hinterland. It is a place that, again, as I always say, in terms of southern Europe, between the Iberian, the Italian, and the Balkan Peninsula, it's really, a hard choice to determine what's the most irreversibly traumatic place to fighting among them. And this was, again, the Iberians knew how to exploit their resources that, of course, varied over time, because at a point that there had been, of course, an exposure, especially of the Iberians, narrowly meant, as you know, to greater civilizations. This somehow brought to their early conquest. Again, they inhabited the more developed areas, the richer one in mines. There were, of course, there were Carthaginian colonies, Hellenic colonies, then the Punics did expand into the hinterland, and the Romans came. And so you have actually this Iberian strip that is essentially in the southeast of the country that was assimilated earlier into the Roman military, and we do not have to think this being sort of less effective or less developed than the one of the Celto-Iberian hinterland, right? But in fact, there are lots of similarities, and it's more difficult to separate the two types of warfare than you may want to actually think, right? When if you think about a Scutarius, as we were saying before, if you at least understand what kind of role a guy equipped with his oval shield would have normally on the battlefield, what could be the difference really between a Celtic warrior Tukor and an Iberian one equipped in the same way? Again, they were pretty much the same, right? But there are some things that at least we can point out from history and archaeology that may help defining better this guy's equipment, and wondering again, what was that for as opposed to other peoples around in a characteristic way. Let's start from, say, the least relevant aspects, costume, right? It would have actually been quite relevant for these guys, the way they looked like. There are some depictions of Iberian Scutari with, for example, some sort of crests, but also mostly some what would seem maybe animal sinews falling from the helmet top that we can't really sort out, but evidently it's not a practical feature. It's rather a matter of identification, of symbolic meaning, whatever, right? But colors, appearance was of course crucial for these guys from a psychological point of view. As far as the costume of a typical Scutarius, and by the way, the pictures you see here do not, I'm sure by now some images of a character have passed or something. So here I mix, it's my usual mix of Iberian, Celtiberian warfare pictures. So if you see a guy with a character, of course, that's not a Scutarius. Like, so I don't mean the video to be about that. Actually, it was difficult to find proper images of Scutari, in part because there are apparently less, in part because just the pictures available on Wikimedia Commons are basically the only ones I can't use for copyright reasons. The Osuna reliefs are some famously the best sources for this, especially the one again with the guy with this apparent sinews falling from his hand that is not hair as far as it seems, render one of the most beautiful depictions of these shields. So all things you can Google if you're interested, and again there are also beautiful images from artwork, historical stuff, and so forth. I can't use them, at least I don't use it anymore because I do everything legal, which Schwerpunkt did was the actual only thing that I could have actually even continued. I had hundreds of thousands of views without any copyright claim, whatever. I know there are lots of people who use that, what they think is a sort of so-called fair use. I don't trust that because there is a lot of gray area, and yes, you can do something with some copyrighted material, but let's say that I prefer to stick to the events I have. So I don't have something particularly punchy in terms of the Scutari evidence as far as these images are concerned, but you will find something, right? There are beautiful, there is the famous Braganza brooch, like that is purely Celtic art in a sense in the far north, and you see essentially what these shields really were. And again, they were pretty much similar. You can't quite differentiate them from the Celtic ones either at some point. Typical of an Iberian warrior would have been a short V-necked linen or woolen tunic, right? Sleeves could be occasionally long, but mostly they were short, in part also because of the warmer weather of Spain, but this has also to do with just general preferences. Think about, naked warriors in Celtic warfare. Here we don't really see much of that in the Iberian Peninsula, for the Iberian Peninsula, but when you fight, you get heated quite fast. So aside from how you get dressed, you want to, on a practical level, there is, in a non-combat situation, there is still some consideration for the particular conditions that do verify in combat. Both Polybius and Livy describe Hannibal's Iberian mercenaries as wearing dazzling white tunics edged in purple. This is interesting. From one side you have purity, from the other you have some sort of more color symbolizing power. So this was apparently a national costume. I've seen, paradoxically, because of video games, that people believe that this was some sort of Carthaginian issue uniform, right, associated with white. But no, it's clear from Polybius that is explicit about this, at least, that this was just a national costume, as it would have not been so strange as a broader symbolism. White means purity, the immaculate sort of heavenly perfection. Purple has to do with, look at this guy's also sort of has earned his status in this world, in fact, in its earthly manifestation. The same Iberian art locally shows tunics with various styles of edging. That sort of makes sense. It would have been a form, in fact, of uniformation for an identification, especially for particular clans and tribes and social status in general. Needless to say, the more affluent individuals were better equipped, the ones that could spend more also for something aesthetical, showing off their wealth or power. Some woolen tunics seem to have instead been black, interestingly enough. Strabo saying specifically that Iberian Highlander, including the Lusitanians, they were, as you know, essentially a different people from both the Iberians and the Celtiberians of Indo-European origin. The Calaiki, so the ones in Galicia, the Asturi, the Cantabria, well, we understand this with the Vascones, Gascon, etc., wore black, right? Mostly black cloaks, specifically. So this actually suggests that some of their tunics would have been black in the first place, but again, I will make more videos about specific Iberian tribes, especially the Lusitanians. So today we talk about the Scutari in general, right? There are some passages that make it confusing, like saying the Lusitanian Caetrati were sort of closer to Scutari, to the Scutarian form of warriors of their heavy infantry function. But again, let's talk about the rule. Then we will see the exception in some other video, right? Completing the costume, you would have a broad leather belt. Naturally, again, the more affluent would adorn this with gold or silver plaques, and this was essentially the equivalent of the Cingulum Militaris, so a bit the emblem of the guy's virility as much as status that could boast the right of bearing arms in these warlike societies, right? In general, in Iberian warfare, you do not see infantry with cloaks. Right, part of the reason could have been just like in I mean, you can use cloaks in fencing some way, but in general, again, these guys had to be quick, agile. We will see it a bit later. Of course, they would have had to shelter themselves also from the weather. They would have had cloaks anyway, but they would preferably, of course, fight without. Some warriors are barefoot. Most of them, however, wear shoes or calf-length boots. And this, again, depends on the kind of terrain or the kind of development of the people. Generally speaking, barefoot warriors come from the more primitive types, not necessarily the ones that would have needed, because of reasons of weather or terrain, some less foot protection, right? Boots in general are sort of hinged again on very broken Iberian terrain. These guys again were masters in guerrilla warfare, hit and run tactics. They knew the terrain pretty well, and this adherence to the ground had to make them quite agile, and also the footwear would help where necessary. But again, man can do miracles even without shoes just in general life, right? We've seen it very often in the Celtic range, so also in Iberia this would have been sort of the same. Once you form a callus after plagues, blood, etc., fundamentally you can't go on very harsh terrain really without minding about your footwear, except again some parts of Iberia were sort of more civilized, people were more gentrified, while others were more brutal and primitive as they could be. And again, we're not splitting hair here, also because this could happen really in the same armies, like just a guy next to another, not necessarily just as a broader trend that we can't identify anyway. So the aforementioned reliefs found at the Iberian fortress of Osuna were in the 3rd to 2nd century BC, provide us with essentially the best and most detailed, especially ancient representations of Scutari warriors. One explanation for the aforementioned sinew headgear is actually a sinew helmet described by Strabo, but it's not really clear how this would be made like, so it could be some sort of decoration as well. Again, I don't think there is necessarily much of an archaeological, if anything, for the function that it had, at least for the structure we can see, right? Because otherwise, this is sort of, I mean, metal, say armor in general could be made of many different material, of course, and this is definitely not a strange eventuality. You have sinews, you want to make a helmet, armor of sinews would do it, but again, what's the point of that? You must have some material that does work in some way or another. You have to justify at least how the structure is put together. We have horsehair crests. These are, again, crests are pretty common, as you know, all over the ancient world. They would have Iberians had a substantial equestrian culture, comparable to the one of the Celts. Actually, it seems that the most advanced, at least in a structural sense, cavalry, including some cataphract cavalry of some sort, was from the Iberians rather than the Celtiberians. But in general, the sense is that the Northerners had, think about the Cantabrian gallop, like this idea that at the end of the day, there was a flourishing equestrian tradition across the entire Iberian Peninsula, to say the least, especially in this sort of hit-and-run function. But not only, and we will pass to that when we talk swords, because there are interesting divides between, in fact, the Iberian and the Celtiberian side that should be explained in a cogent fashion. In any case, regarding probably how certain blades, let's say certain swords, would adapt to what kind of warfare. That again, it's not really clear in detail. Like, you know that when you study ancient warfare in general, you do not have that sort of quantitative comparative dimension. Like, you have, again, this very few historical remarks, and then basically we have to go through archaeology. It's also quite, first of all, it's incomplete. In many ways, it can be read in much more complex ways than history, but it also relatively untelling in terms of structural differences, at least regarding specific types of items and their quantity, say, or why they were found, where they were produced. So you have just to sharpen your mind a bit, and also risking to make hypotheses. And let's go to the armament, specifically the offensive weapons. So the Scutari would, as heavy infantry, carry various heavy throwing spears. In other words, heavy javelins, right? This is a bit like the Roman pilum conceptually, right? Now we will see all the various types that, of course, yes, are also similar to the Roman pilum that was not really coming out of a vacuum. Think about the Geisum, etc. These peoples had always similar weapons. In fact, there wasn't even such an enormous Iberian sort of output literally grafted into, for example, Roman warfare just per se, right? Mostly, again, the Romans had been knowing different types of blades and of spears, etc. And you must understand, if anything, why at a certain point in history they decided to uniform towards a specific direction or another. But it's mostly just a refinement of armament and equipment in general for the specific needs of an army with a certain level of professionalism, collective training, rather than, let's say, some sort of strange, say, liking or preference for this or that thing, right? And essentially, they remain the same type of warriors. So, the most distinctive throwing spear is the Iberian Soliferum in Livy's Latin, and Saunian or Saunian Olosideran in Diodorus Hellenic. from the etymology of these words, both in Latin and in Hellenic, you understand what the meaning of this is. Basically, a heavy javelin made entirely of metal, of iron specifically, right? The term saunion, without specification, that's why I added holosideron from the source, is a more generic term per se. It's just like the term lonke, that was the Libo-Phoenician heavy javelin, and that, however, can mean different things. You find them for some marines in the Eastern Mediterranean, you find it for some as lanks for some horsemen in the Hellenistic world, etc. So, again, same words can mean slightly different type of weapons that were thus linguistically conceptualized in this case for reasons that are not immediately evident semantically. But in this case, again, the sources match, right? The soliferium was used all over the Iberian Peninsula. Its size varies from 1 meter and 60 centimeters to 2 meters. It had a pretty nasty, small, barbed head. It also tapered to a point at the back, a bit like the Sauropter, the lizard killer. This naturally was a versatile weapon. The central shaft essentially broadened to form a grip, like that was also sort of squeezing in between. And the section of this heavy javelin was usually square or hexagonal, which, considering also its composition, tells you that this was a pretty effective anti-armor weapon, right? We will see in other types of warriors that are more heavily armored, generally speaking, with this meant. Where, again, we find pretty advanced sort of types of armor that today we do not describe, because the Scutarius in itself was not on average heavily armored. Like you could have, I don't know, a chest plate or something, but some would just literally wear just clothing as well. So as an average trooper, yes, in the Iberian Peninsula they weren't like uniform, nor they could have been uniformly armored in metal, and so we can speculate about some organic armor, but this is not so important. Like at the end of the day, they were mostly unarmored. But of course, such type of weapon tells us that there was a significant amount of armor around. Again, the soliferium was not the only type of heavy javelin, as we will see now, so it doesn't mean that, again, these guys were... it would have been impossible and extremely costly to equip them just with this. But the fact that this type of weapon is around, and that also armor is significantly around, considering the times and the places, or think about the Roman invasion and occupation, the fact that normally legionnaires had some, tendentially having some degree of armor, metal armor uniformity, has to do with this as well. Always reflect. Naturally, these weapons, as all weapons characteristic of a people, are designed, they're based on local warfare needs, right, necessities. So this is true still for the Iberians, but it would have become very handy when facing the Roman legions as well. And in fact, the Romans were terrified. At least, there is the anti-war propaganda saying, in the Iberian Peninsula, you always fall into ambushes, they attack you at night, they don't make you do all these terrible things. This was actually a very brutal world, don't get me wrong, but as we were saying before, at the end of the day, most of the resistance was just guerrilla, and it was mostly the fact that the Romans were not particularly motivated to fight there. It's a bit Rome's Vietnam, except they won, and they had some broader mission to accomplish there. Can be an interesting comparison. There are more elaborate grips also in these weapons, like I will not digress in the minutiae. In any case, we have also different typologies here. For example, the central shaft could broaden to form a grip, right? But there are, as I said, broad varieties. here of a heavy javelin, including one with a 36 centimeter socketed head, which basically is like the light pilum type. You know, the pila were actually differentiated on the basis of the distance they were employed. The lighter one was the first one to be thrown at a greater distance, the heavier one at closer range. And of course we can imagine for all these people something similar, right? When we think about the incredible systematization that the Romans made about their heavy javelin employment, this doesn't mean that the other peoples did not use that. Like other types of formations that were used obviously and normally, even as just in nothing special. The studo is, described for the goals as well. That's what every single kind of infantry that has no better way of defending itself in open field would do, right? You raise the shield and try to cover yourself. There is nothing special, particular, etc. The important is mastering that. Of course, the Romans seem to have mastered the heavy javelin employment on the basis, again, of their superior collective training, and the fact, again, that they had a drive that these peoples just politically, in a cohesive sense, did really not have, right? And this was reflected in the military, but the same need of these troops would be fundamentally the same. These heavy javelins were also apparently not standardized. There were just different types that are even difficult to categorize. And we would have been surprised also by the capacity of these peoples just to fabricate, to produce these weapons in some dire straits condition, etc., knowing how to live in the wilderness in many ways. Another nasty weapon was the phalarica, as described by Livy. This was essentially an incendiary javelin. It had a 90 centimeters long iron head and a fierce shaft, right, which is round in section, except that it's square where it joins the head, right? Remember that the quadrangular section is better to impact metal armor, right, for physical reasons. And so this could be, again, a quite versatile weapon, but the most distinctive feature this weapon featured at the siege of Numantia, for example, was the hand sunk into the shaft and riveted through the broad square portion, like instead the Roman bigger, like thicker pilum, and this square section was bound with pitch-soaked tow, which was essentially set alight before the spear was thrown. So you had quite not just an effective weapon as a heavy javelin, but also the additional fire effect. It could in many ways just be psychological or sort of, in fact, firework-like, but it surely was not something you would have liked, being thrown at you. And there are different ways you can use it also just to set on fire certain structures and so on. Of course, Scutarius would rely on spears as well. We tend to forget how the most common type of weapon among all these peoples was, of course, the spear. Even if we were to describe the Roman army, it wasn't just about the triarii, for example, that would use a spear in many situations. Also for the early imperial legionaries, actually we think that the spear was a more common weapon than we tend to think. I made a video about the Gladius Hispaniensis that is in part also connected to today's topic as we will pass to the swords. But there was all a symbolism behind that had to do literally with this violation of the word for killing and so sacrificing, but also molding through this more kind of ferocious and spectacularly butchering weapon fundamentally. And all this also the employ of heavy javelins in a collective fashion. In fact, the Romans would have this capacity, in fact, passing directly to the sword after a charge into spearmen's formation that, however, were hampered bogged down by these the incredibly thick pilum pila shower right just before the attack that that would allow them to sort of bypass the spear that in of itself is actually a more effective weapon individually and with the right level of training also collectively than simply the spear, right? This is an aspect that I'm not sure how it's been investigated that much historiographically, but the fact still that the Romans, in fact, appear prominently as swordsmen is a quite fascinating aspect to consider. This all for saying that the Scutari, of course, were equipped with spears, right? Thrusting ones, right? Not just throwing ones / heavy javelins. There would be you can throw a thrusting spear as well, right? Nothing prohibits you from doing that. Actually, it would have been difficult to some degree, aside from the general separation in type to distinguish a spear from a javelin. Yet also for the Iberian peoples, sources talk more typically of a shower of javelins followed up by sword melee. This is, again, fascinating. The sense is that these populations, and if you consider just how combat occurs, which is essentially an engagement lasting at the longest a few minutes, right before the two formations separate if they haven't broken each other, of course, was very much functionalized and gravitating around using this shock effect, like softening up, disordering the enemy lines just before the charge through this heavy javelin shower, then to exploit again a disorder that would have been decisive, so that the effectiveness also of a spear wall would have at some point been broken, and it's objectively the case here among peoples that also didn't probably follow such incredibly thick battle formations, especially as far as spearmen were concerned, right? That there would be some of more open order compared, say, to the Macedonian phalanx that was surely an exception in that regard. And it's basically saying Roman philosophy is the same Celtic philosophy. We see more spears among the Celts, I think, in a statistical sense, but again, these peoples fought all in pretty similar ways, and the idea that after all, you could you could essentially trigger a more decisive dynamic by coupling these two phases, like javelin and sword, is quite seductive, because it would have been sort of the most effective way at that point of bypassing the spear. In many ways. Then there would be a lot to say regarding what kind of spears as well. I talked about this a bit in that video about the Battle of the Allia River, for times in which, in fact, it depends on the societies, right? What kind of training you can provide troops with, even individually with a spear, right? At the time, rather than a thick spear, we'll have like individual warriors using the spear as a primary weapon, even in an individual sense, or at least in a much more individualistic way than simply maintaining cohesion of the formation that to some degree was not possible, at least to maintain an extremely thick order, like a phalangitic one. So and here again we go by degrees. You know that the Greeks called fundamentally phalanx every type of heavy infantry they encounter of any other people. Right, so the Romans had a phalanx, the Celts had a phalanx. Of course, these peoples never had the phalanx narrowly meant, and I made a video explaining this regarding especially the Romans in the Etruscans of the early era, because people tell you that at some point they copied the Hellenic phalanx that never existed. Like, it's not that it happened a bit like it. No, it never existed. What they meant was something completely different. Some sources are later, and they're just making that up, and for very specific ideological purposes that are well investigated historically, but I'm not going down that way in this video, because otherwise we never end. But it's worth mentioning again that, albeit of course spears were quite common in Iberian warfare, there is this sense of aggressiveness that is pretty common to all the peoples that we describe here, at least mostly north, let's say in southwestern Europe, among the Gauls, the Italics, the Iberians, that are very similar in this regard. But again, bear this in mind that the Iberians are seen more as skirmishers, which doesn't mean that they didn't have heavy infantry. The Scutari were actually the proof of that. But it depends also on how much cohesion you can have for a large number of men on the battlefield, right? We have kilometers, pitched battles of large, Celtic hosts back in the day against the Romans, whatever. About the Iberians, it's something much more redimensioned, right? And the first explanation is always political, right? I can tell you by experience, working in the field, that the absence of major pitched battles does not actually mean that people doesn't do that. Actually, in this kind of European Mediterranean dimension, everybody does that, right? There's not a people that is so guerrilla-based like the Iberians, that doesn't fight in open ground with large numbers of men, that doesn't line up troops in an orderly fashion, etc., with all the limits again that tribal peoples have, that truly make them handicapped against, at this point, what the Roman army was becoming. But they do that, right? And the fact that they wouldn't, in particular historical situations, is merely political. It's merely about who had the guts of, in fact, taking the field against this or that people, when you could simply shelter yourself, having a smooth process of, actually accepting Romanization and or cooperating with the Romans, and or just wanting not to expose yourself too much just out there. It's a typical strategic and tactical behavior of peoples that are confronting some much bigger and more advanced opponent, and just don't even have much of a chance at a point to oppose like a concerted opposition to that degree of cohesion. If you do not have that political unity, it's that easy to see the asymmetry in this field, right? But of course, there were big engagements, not just with the Romans, but especially among other Iberians. And of course, these guys were the Scutari were the heavies, right? Perhaps slightly lighter than, say, maybe what a Celtic heavy could be. Maybe it's a speculative term, but it kind of makes sense. And it's not just about the heaviness of the equipment, or the wealth of the same, or the technological advancement, or the very fine blade quality. Now we pass to the swords that makes this, right? You can have much tougher, courageous infantry, even for more primitive people, right? Think about, the Germans versus the Celts, right? At this point, the Germans really consistently kicked ass, even though they were a properly prehistorical people that really was much less advanced than the same Celts. And that's a reason of political cohesion, of moral force, right? They were not at the Roman level, but at the same time they could beat these guys as well. In any case, the commonest Iberian sword type, notoriously, is the so-called falcata, right? Which stands for espada falcata in Spanish, right? So the equivalent of this sword is the Hellenic kopis, notoriously. Say equivalent or variant, if you prefer, because we will see now there are some slight differences. The concept is really the same. These are swords that were born, say, in the Bronze Age. They had quite a specific design and physics. Xenophon praises these weapons as the best ones you can use from horseback. We talked about this in the videos about Hellenic cavalry that you can check out. And this is, in fact, an interesting datum, because the Iberians had also a significant amount of equestrian warfare, as we were recalling before. So from the 5th century, you see this falcata / kopis pretty much everywhere in the Iberian Peninsula. Yet, and this is the aspect that makes you wonder, it was most characteristic in the south and the southeast of the peninsula. In other words, the areas populated by the Iberians. Right. Now, before passing to the characteristics of this world, let's just reflect on the difference between the Iberian and the Celtiberian regions, right? Because the Celts, as you know, like they have invaded the Iberian Peninsula across the centuries, and they have created this. They're actually still Iberians, right? But they have an important Celtic cultural influence also. A material one in terms of arms and armor. And really, Celtiberians and Iberians fought in very similar ways. They are, in fact, even difficult to simply split. And in fact, the more I studied this regional context, and the more I stopped sort of trying to divide them. Of course, there were some divides, but in order to, to be relevant in this, I should lengthen dramatically this video, and I don't want to do that specifically. I can make a video explaining that, researching also a bit more, because I also confess I'm not, of course, an expert on this topic. I mean, ancient warfare is, of course, an old passion of mine. I began that even before medieval one, but let's say again, the need to separate this kind of warfare is sort of irrelevant. But one point is, again, why do we find more Falcatae in the Iberian areas as opposed to the Celtiberian one? Very difficult question. Naturally, this doesn't necessarily mean that there was more or less cavalry, right? It can simply mean that there was more material wealth, for example, in this area, so we find more Falcatas, right? Because even if you find different types of weapons, like the Celtic areas were surely influenced by, in fact, the straight blades of the Latin culture, right? And actually, the Roman gladius hispaniensis was modeled on the blend of the two, right? The gladius was not had a symmetric blade, and it was sort of the fusion between, in fact, the sort of straight Latin sword that is actually what this looked much more like. Like what is strange is that say the Roman gladius is often portrayed also in historical art, say modern art, as this leaf-shaped kind of blade. But if you look at the very first samples, and also the ones actually throughout the entire the use of the gladius hispaniensis type, and especially ones connected with the Iberian influence, you realize that these were very substantially long straight blades, right? They had much more in common with the later spada, that is technically basically the same sword, conceptually, especially when you compare it to a falcata, than in fact this kind of other curved type. So actually, the Roman gladius hispaniensis owes much more to the Celtic design, always bearing in mind that the Romans fought still, like they had been fighting with coppice, with I talked this in the videos about Roman archaic warfare, right? But again, the differences were minimal in terms of practical effect with the swords that the Celts used, that had, for example, the same length, right? We look at the goals in Italy at the time of the Aldia, for example, that we talked about before. They were essentially the same thing. Is it a curved or a straight blade better to kill the enemy? It's like asking, is it a black or a white cat more effective at catching a mouse? Again, I don't like the idea that it's so relevant, right? And especially considering that every warrior has different skills, and at the end of the day, it's the formation that makes the thing rather than the individual equipment just per se, right? The technology doesn't make tactics. It's the other way around, or at least it makes tactics just to the minimal degree. And so when you look at the Romans, let's say, quote-unquote, adopting these weapons, what they were actually doing were just modeling their own weapons towards designs that it's not that they had discovered the day before and decided to adopt and mass in their army. They were already there. They had always been there. And just they sort of could be at this point even just produced locally by guys that said had a hell of a metallurgic tradition, like in Iberian, that basically made the blades like that. That is also an overlooked aspect of the story. The main difference, however, going back to the Iberian falcata, proper, the ethnic sword, if we can so say, again, universal weapon, was in fact identical to the coppice, but this is the difference, is that the back edge of the falcata was sharpened near the point. So in other words, it was the same type of blade, but this sword could essentially thrust much better than cutting. And this was just the, again, asymmetric cutting sword, right? So when you think about the Gladius Hispaniensis, these are all things I explained in that video about the sword. It's not even to say that they needed to be more like a hybrid with a Latin sword just to be an effective thrusting sword, right? Of course, also falcata was a thrusting sword, right? There is all this nonsensical thing repeated over and over again, also just in pop culture, because the academia, of course, has never had this problem, that the Roman gladius was just for thrusting. Let's leave aside that the Roman gladi types did evolve towards something more effective in thrusting for reasons that that are actually the thickening of the Roman order, likely in the later centuries, but consider that there were lots of auxiliaries fighting, and also lots of weapons that the legionnaires used that we do not necessarily see in that regard. But the Gladius Hispaniensis, was an excellent cutting weapon, right? It could chop people to pieces, cutting limbs. Ask the Macedonians at Pydna, famously enough. This was a wild weapon, right? The Romans already used the coppice on their own in Italy from centuries. They were completely and especially extremely excited in chopping people to pieces, right? If this is something that you can attribute to a Roman legionnaire, was exactly this, right? Making a human butchery as a living. And the ancient warfare being plain butchery to a degree that we fortunately don't even have the picture to see. You think that you live in the world of shells and maim, all the type of explosively destructive devices, but that's not like in proportion, like in considering that you do it yourself, that you're actually cutting a living person to pieces in front of your eyes. It's not just like throwing a grenade at a couple of 100 meters. That's literally doing that, and especially taking pride at that. That's how these people were brought up and further indoctrinated and absolutely exalted. And if you wonder how they also succeeded, this is not just about the bloodthirst. It was about the fact that they were also extremely, which culturalists will never tell you, extremely cold, rational, squared people, right? This is the beauty of the effectiveness of human civilization. The more powerful, the more advanced, the most destructive and powerful, at least destructive potentially, but especially the most effective, militarily speaking, is the combination of modernity with tradition. Something that the Romans stopped in a unrepeated fashion in the history of mankind, in their cultural blend, which is in fact fascinating when you look at the Iberians that had, this kind of swords that were in many ways also looking like the Gladius Hispaniensis in the way the Romans uniformed, but that seemed in fact to have been more pertinent to the Celtiberian rather than the Iberian area, right? The Iberians surely had this sort of more straight blades as well, absolutely, but they seem to have made more use of the coppice, right? Why? It's not to be determined. It could be as banal, because the question is, how did Celtiberian and again Iberian warfare would differ? My take is literally that we found more stuff in the Iberian side of the story, archaeologically. Maybe a simplistic explanation but I don't see any other reason why we would have sort of more concentrated finds on that side, as opposed to the Celtiberians. The Celtiberians surely would have had straighter blades because of the Celtic influence on average, right? But surely they would still use coppice as they would. And again, excellent weapons. Some falcatae types have a bar joining pommel and guard to protect the hand. The blade on average was something from the finds like between 35-52 centimeters long. So they weren't even just so small. Swords, considering also people were smaller at the time. There were other types of swords, again, straighter one, more recalling the Xiphas, if you want, but that also matched that sword. To some extent, they seemed like daggers, right? But the word would be longer Celtic types of swords. So this all depends on the type of trooper. Again, when you think of the Celtiberians, don't think they were more Celtic than Iberians, right? It was sort of the other way around. And so the question is, why would they have this apparently smaller swords? Well, it's just apparent, meaning that most warriors couldn't really have big swords. Also for the Celts, it's actually overly emphasized, right? Especially when you look at the age of the 5th to 4th century BC Celtic expansion, you realize that many of the Celts that the Greeks and the Romans met were warbanders, right? I made a video explaining the difference with the other type of regular infantry levies that you would have found in Central Europe at the time. And as such, these guys were sort of professional warriors. They would collect weapons, they would be very well equipped on a regular basis. Even when they were sort of primitive and poor, otherwise, I don't know, fighting naked, whatever, the sword was still a great symbol of power and prestige, right? Even more so because they came from pretty primitive backgrounds. Boasting a sword was sort of more important than armor, also because armor would at that point require some, on a larger scale, some different type of more advanced tactics that in terms of order of the formation that these peoples did not have. So of course the Celts had excellent metallurgical skills. I made a video about that, and especially also the legacy in Roman and Germanic arms and armor. But still, just the elite essentially boosted this, right? So the idea that the average Celtic infantryman was a swordman is grossly exaggerated. As a consequence, most peoples actually would prefer fighting with smaller swords, some sort of daggers. This existed in the Celtic world as well. So the Iberians, the Celtic Iberians, do not make really an exception as such, right? The sense is that the best preserved and sort of equally larger Celtic swords belong to the elites in a culture of championship of aristocrats or people that had an enormous wealth, right? Especially in the more advanced areas of the Celtic world. We talk about Gallic warfare, trying to distinguish it in fact exactly because of this in a better way from the rest of the Celtic world, right? So if the coppice was so popular in the Iberian world, like say the Celtiberian one could not differ even that much and wouldn't have necessarily, because you see the Celtiberian world was less developed than certain parts of Central Europe. Right, this is clear. Like the Iberian Peninsula was not that particularly advanced, except this, in fact, areas of south and southeastern Spain. There were different worlds. As a consequence, that full championship, sort of quasi-feudal, proto-feudal system you find in Gaul could not really be found in northern Spain. Right, it wasn't quite the same thing. They were similar, but by degree there was something a bit less than that. It's sort of looser. Hence the idea that infantries and cavalries were slightly lighter as well in the Iberian Peninsula compared to to the Celtic world. And in my opinion, it's the Iberians that are actually overlooked in some way, but the fact that they were taken over, in fact, by the Carthaginians and the Romans sort of prevents us from understanding better the differences with the autonomous differences that would have arisen or that would have existed with the Celtiberian world as well. Just, that the northern you go, the poorer the landscape really is, broadly meant, militarily too, right? So the Celtiberians would turn out to be sort of the best warriors, don't get me wrong, but not necessarily because of a better equipment, right? Then at least the types that we do not quantitatively have the measure of arms and armor used in the Iberian world that were sort of much more advanced in terms of arts and crafts and so on. They were richer, right? But not necessarily more military effective, but also not that less than we thought them compared to the Celtiberians. This is the personal opinion that I developed over the years, right? These more straight swords would be also half a meter long. For Scutarius, that would have been cool, okay. They would be, yes, a more characteristically Celtiberian weapon, and it is from this type that the Gladius Hispaniensis actually stands in the Roman army, right? A cut and thrust weapon. Always remember that. The notion that the Gladius is just a thrusting weapon in the more advanced early imperial types is BS, right? They cut as hell, right? They were designed specifically to cut people, right? Cut limbs, heads. They did it fantastically. So scabbards were worn. I could digress on the metallurgical advancement of the Iberian Peninsula. Was quite a big deal, and so these swords had terrific characteristics, but today we do not make the video just about the sword in itself. Again, the video about the Celtic legacy, metallurgic legacy in the Romano-Germanic arms and armor explains also the characteristics of the Gladius Hispaniensis, and I made a video, and the general swords that were used also in pre-Roman Iberia, and I have made a video about the Gladius Hispaniensis, and we'll surely come back on the topic. But they were very hard yet flexible weapons, so they were excellent in many ways, and that's why the Romans were reliant locally, especially on the Celtiberian smiths, some of which were brought to Rome. Then eventually Rome sort of focuses more on the Calbis Noricum in the northeast to Italy, that for simply a reason of quality of the metal, right, dug in those Norican Alps, from which still a naturally well balanced carbonized iron is still extracted in Austria, which is also fascinating. And the Romans mostly used that for their military in the early empire. But you see, it's a matter of convenience. It's a contingency, if you want, not a law, or just these people now taught the Romans how to use swords or taught with this type or what. No, it was all pretty much out there already. They just refined what was on the market fundamentally, thanks to their conquests that evidently happened without even the need of having more advanced weapons, if we can consider them as such, by the way, which is another interesting debate, but again, not for today. Scabbards were held by the Iberians on the left from a baldric. They were usually made of wood or leather. They had metal edging and bands to hold the suspension rings. The Romans sort of adopted part of this as well, together with the weapons. Some scabbards were even all iron. There could be even a further side weapon like a knife attached to the same falcata scabbard, right, with its blade the same shape as the sword, as a matter of fact. This could be the equivalent of a Roman pugio, for example. In between, as weapons types, you had some sort of dagger. Could be either triangular blades or small versions of the same sword shapes. Again, let's not search for uniformity. This depended on the warrior's affluence, whatever he could have at that point in combat or on campaign, etc. Right. So obviously we have to talk about the shield, which gives the name to the warrior, at least historiographically. There is really not much of a great difference from the Celtic and specifically the Gallic types, right? They were pretty large oval shields with metal edging, the central hand grip parallel to the long axis of the shield. There are, however, interesting shield patterns that are typically Iberian. On some Valencian vases we find these designs that were, again, they were actually similar to the same Gallic ones, and they display sort of quadrangular, let's say some rhomboid, concentrical rhomboids, and some other motives symbolizing, the, say, universal order to some extent, the role of the warrior in this, the sort of projection of this force toward forward, like ahead. There are all these S shapes as well they could be either phytomorphic or zoomorphic conceptually in a very primitive geometrical conceived sense, right? Surely they had a very specific meaning that these warriors could have told us from their tribal mythology, but unfortunately none of that has arrived to us. I'm sure you could derive something from comparative analysis of some Celtic evidence, but we're not dramatically informed about that either, especially for these more sort of stylized designs. And actually, again, the picture is more interesting as far as the weapons is concerned, the assortment of the same, the different combination you could have this type of weapons, and of course as we've seen, the reliance on weapons that could be used in not just on in a battle line, battle formation. For example, the size of the swords or the daggers is interesting because you can imagine that in guerrilla warfare, a more compact type of blade is sort of handier, right? It can be wielded more effectively, right, in smaller spaces with closer range, even just, again, think about an ambush or whatever, surprise attacks. I remember the shock effect even in open field with the javelins passing immediately to the sword. And so in ways that tell us that there was an important degree of individualism, of course, in this warfare, but also in the sense, not just in the combat per se, but also in the way these guys would move on terrain and would sort of exploit it during their incursions and, again, surprise attacks, etc. All right. The evident missile capacity, diversity. But there is not a big deal of archery involved, like documented for Iberian warfare. There were lots of slings. We were talking the other day just about Castilian warfare and how even later in the Middle Ages the Iberian world displays a greater amount of sling warfare. And you see also this anti-armor capacity in the process, so that's fascinating. That speaks of a sort of refined missile warfare that even if it's not that long range, but it's designed to be quite surgical, and so that there is even some proper specialization and sort of aptness and habituation to this kind of weapons in in a context that does definitely seem very individual in many ways. It doesn't speak of weapons largely systematically functionalized for a large battle open field formation in close order. They could definitely assemble into such arrays, and they would, and the Scutarius as such is that heavy infantryman that does fight in that way. But overall, it seems that it's about the impetus, it's about the attack. This is what we're told about Celtiberian tactics, that they were differently from other peoples. You see, the Celts were stereotypically pictured as loading everything on a single charge and then breaking if it failed. Right? It's very simplified, but tendentially that's the bit. About the Iberians, the sense was that they would actually break in the same way, but they would hide somewhere and come back doing this back and forth. In other words, that's hit and run tactics that they would be able to carry out, they would be habituated to carry out on a regular basis just in their own warfare, because they were that flexible, because they were that sort of also economizing with their own local resources, were not immense on a very tough ground and with very tough environment, and with this habitual focus on saying, yes, there's not even a shame technically in retreating if you come back fighting, and they would do that repeatedly. Evidently, they could not sustain like prolonged combat in open field on the evidence that they weren't bringing those heavy of armies calibrated for that type of combat, because they would have been too expensive, and just their political background wouldn't allow to master them regularly with that degree of effectiveness. So they also large quantities with large quantities of troops, they would preferably make hit and run tactics, being able to disperse quite swiftly without being like taking refuge in this fortified top hills, sometimes like a rat's nest in many ways. Very difficult conditions, and in some cases in semi-arid areas, but still in that sense being coordinated in a way that was in this sense commendable, incredible, the way they could reunite their forces just to hit in a single way. So again, a type of warfare critically functionalized for this hit and run tactics that were also, as you know, pretty effective on their own. So I'm glad we could talk finally about some unit from this context. We will talk about many others, telling you the truth, because the Iberian Peninsula is also huge, extremely varied in many ways. Again, the local warfare is pretty similar, but there are different, like lots of different types of evidence, of different types of troopers. We will talk about cavalry also, and obviously so. There wasn't much of a difference actually with the infantry, except these guys tended to wear more armor, more helmets, more cloaks as well, as we've seen these infantrymen weren't at least depicted often with. And it's also about a type of warfare which, of course, we cannot see, obviously enough, how it really was, but that you can sort of appreciate in this, again, incredible resilience in the face of, say, superior enemies' onslaughts, right, and just exploiting the incredibly tough Iberian terrain that they were, of course, accustomed to, and we will surely appreciate all this in the various videos we will hopefully make, and reflecting further on these differences and the capacities of these troops quite concretely. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.